Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. If you are new to the channel, if you're new to what we do, please hit like, please hit subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell, as we are constantly adding new programming to the channel all the time, because I always get these bright ideas to add more shows and increase my workload. I love you guys. Today is a special episode because we have, I don't even know how many times this guy's been on the show. It doesn't even matter. He's a part of the crew. He's a part of the show. But we're not going to go to the champagne room since we did the recap of the video essay. Thank you guys for watching it. I believe this is the best video essay debut we've had so far. If you guys haven't seen it, it's definitely up. It's in the playlist for TIR video essays. The latest one is called Personal Jesus, The Seduction of Philanthrocapitalism. I definitely reached out to Rob Larson, who was a big influence on this piece, as he's written about philanthrocapitalism in his first two books, Capitalism versus Freedom, and also Bit Tyrants. Definitely Bit Tyrants was a big influence. I went back and read a few of the chapters where he wrote about specifically Microsoft and their lawsuits, and got a big shout out from Rob Larson, so I appreciate that. Also, don't forget, my co-host, my homie, my dog, has a clip going around the interwebs right now, as he was on Woke Bros with Wrzesniewski and Nando Vila. That's a very, very good clip. A lot of people love it. I saw someone even say on the Twitters that Pascal is their favorite Haitian. How dare they take away my moniker for Pascal, because he's my favorite Haitian. I'll take you one further. He's my favorite Haitian from South Florida. So take that. So let me bring in the man of the Mau Mau Hour, who also had some great commentary on the video essay about how philanthropy funded the black chattering class. So let me bring in the man of the Mau Mau Hour. Oh, this music is so perfect. Pascal Robert.
Yes, y'all. Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. Shout out to Big Wrzesniewski, Big Woz, giving us love on the Twitters. Appreciate that very much.
That was a very nice shout out that Wozni that gave us.
Let me tell you something. We've been putting out such great content. I have to stagger my distribution of the content, because literally just in the week we've just done, there's too much. I haven't even sent out the Jordan Peterson one yet, and that's really good.
Shout out to Colin. Did you see the message Colin sent us?
No.
He sent us a thank you message, and he asked if it was okay.
Thank him.
He asked if it was okay if he cut a clip of us of the conversation. I was like, oh, no problem. As a matter of fact, when you're done cutting it, why don't you send it to me so I can put it up on our channel?
Hello. The Peterson, that's going to be in distribution soon. The show last night, Off the Mitrax, have not even yet begun to distribute that in my various methodologies of online distribution. The numbers are doing well for all of them.
Yes, and that show was so funny about the video essay shows is when I did the video essay recap show for the Bill Cosby video essay, it was Teray, Bertram Cooper, and me. So those numbers did double what the video essay did. And what a lot of people don't understand is with the footage I take, sometimes YouTube suppresses the video. So the Bill Cosby video, it took them about a month before I fought the suppression. So the views didn't catch up. The recap had double the amount of views than the actual video essay. That's the one Malcolm Jamal Warner commented on.
That's right.
Which is pretty cool. Theo commenting on the video essay. So this one was a little different, where the recap still has more views, but the views of the video essay and the recap are pretty much neck and neck, which was, for me, it's pretty cool to see that people are actually watching these and definitely commenting on them. Like I say, if you have something to say, please drop it in the comments. Pascal might read them before I do. I'm easily triggered.
And shout out to the Majority Report, man. I underestimated how people responded to that appearance. People are still like, "Oh, dude, man, you were on Majority Report." I was like, "Yeah, wasn't that like last week?"
Thank you, Sam Cedar. We appreciate the signal boost, as they say.
Yeah, man. A lot of people responded well to that, and much love, man. Much love to Sam Cedar, Majority Report, Wrzesniewski. Good people, man. A lot of people have been very supportive of our efforts here, and I think that they contribute to us being motivated to put out good content and good quality work.
No, I really appreciate it. We're seeing a bump in the patronage, which is allowing us to do things like go over a little bit on the time here today and do a free show for you guys with a pretty esteemed guest. You know, he isn't just some Yahoo from the internet that we met. I mean, this is a real deal.
We have had some good guests who literally were Yahoos from the internet. We literally have had some great shows with people who were just Yahoos from the internet that we met.
That's true. I'm not afraid to talk to internet Yahoos, but our guest today is not an internet Yahoo. He's a very serious professor who I'm probably going to have to talk to in person at some point about going to do this live show, which looks like we're moving the location, and we really want him to do the live show. And I'm kind of excited. So I'm going to tell him off air about the new developments in the live show that he agreed to be a part of and how much cooler it's actually getting. So I'm excited to tell him that. And then hopefully sooner than later, I'll have news for you guys on that as well. I did have a long, good conversation with Ben Burgess last night. We're going to be doing a show. Teray and I are going to be doing a show with Ben about what's that movie with that white guy? White guy killed people. American Psycho.
Oh, okay, great.
We're going to be doing a show about American Psycho. And then we're also going to be doing one on Assault on Precinct 13, the original version.
That's what's up.
So before we bring in our guest, there was a news story that grabbed my attention that I don't see too many people talking about on the left or anywhere for that matter, mainly because of who it involves: the unhoused. Mental health services, the people that work in them, and the conditions those same individuals are subject to working in. A young counselor by the name of David McKnight Hillman at the Wayfinder Youth Facility in Los Angeles was killed by a mob of young teens when he responded to a call about a young man that was reported to be high or drunk, breaking windows, spraying a fire extinguisher, and the young man in question had flipped over a refrigerator. The counselor took the young man out to a courtyard to calm him down, as we normally do in these situations. As the counselor took the young man out to a courtyard, several of the teens followed them out, and witnesses say the counselor was attacked by the teens, and 6 days later, he died from his injuries. This is something that I understand all too well working in these types of environments. And I don't know if many people that love protesting or calling for protests or drop off food and leave really know what it's like working in these conditions. At the Wayfinder facility, the police told the employees to only call if a fight was in progress. By the time law enforcement would arrive, of course, it's too late. This was due to the high number of calls at the facility. They had 827 calls to 911 in 2020 alone. Much like the facility I worked at, security is just an avatar. They serve no purpose, as they are not allowed to intervene. I repeat, they are not allowed to intervene. Just observe and report. Once where I worked in Oakland, when 2 young women were being threatened by a resident physically, a security guard could be seen walking by in the cameras, ignoring the incident, acting as if nothing was happening as the young ladies were yelling for help. These are not isolated incidents. They just don't get reported. Politicians who roll these programs out, usually Democrats, don't want negative press. Republicans love when things like this happen, as they can point to it and say, programs like this don't work. We need harsher sentences. The nonprofits don't want to lose the funding dollars, so they stay quiet about the violence inside as well. That's why they have no problem hiring people with drug offenses, criminal records, because they're less likely to go to the police or press. When I hear the abolish or defund people talk about getting counselors and mental health professionals to respond to calls like the one that cost this young man his life, I often wonder how many of them have actually ever worked in services. You're constantly understaffed, under-resourced, overworked, and your safety concerns are constantly ignored. This is from the LA Times article. Records reviewed by the Times contain accounts of myriad assaults and injuries at Wayfinder in recent years. In one incident, a teen suffered first-degree burns. In another, a pregnant staff member was elbowed in the stomach. A staff member also said they were assaulted in a room in 2018 by a group of juveniles while others blocked the door. These are prison-like conditions. Former employees told the Times they often worried they would be physically harmed at work. After seeing some of the violence actually take place, I would actually say to myself, is it safe to come to work today? Said CJ Cormier, who quit his job as a counselor, in part because of safety concerns. Cormier, who left Wayfinder after 2 months before the McKnight Hillman was killed, said that he was not properly trained to de-escalate the frequent violent clashes between residents, and that working there was like being thrown to the wolves. The youth had a lot of power, dictating what they were going to do, not necessarily what they were supposed to do. Some days it could be very hostile. A youth could be riled up for whatever reason. They pretty much did whatever they wanted. It's true. No one can afford to lose their job, so staff are often too cautious. It's also hard to suspend or evict people, even for a night, for violent or threatening behavior. The only protection you have is to quit. How can you staff a facility and truly try to help people if these are the conditions in which you work? If we as a society truly want to address these problems of the unhoused, we have to stop thinking we can warehouse the problem. Stuffing a bunch of people with a myriad of issues, often in wet shelters, isn't the answer. It's just trying to move the visual blight of societal collapse into a concrete closet and hide it where no one can see and complain. Smaller facilities where people can get one-on-one care that are properly funded is a big step in the right direction. But first, we have to start looking at these people not as commodities in which we can profit on, but as actual living, breathing human beings that are deserving of adequate care. And on that note, let's bring in the man you guys really came to see. He is everyone's favorite Marxist economist professor in the Inland Empire. He is the Asatar Bair.
Glad to be back on the program. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
Thank you. Good to see you, Dr. Bair. I've only been living in the ether of your tweets, catching
That's not a bad place to live.
The vibes. And I want to say I'm really glad to have you on. And we're really talking on some touchy stuff today. I don't know, Jason, you want to start off, or are you going to let me have the luxury of kicking off the questions?
I'm going to let you have the luxury of kicking off the questions because you personally, as people don't know, because they're not that close with you, you've been concerned about inflation since Joe Biden made a public statement about inflation, and you've been following not just domestic inflation, but what's going on
Fed.
overseas in the Ukraine are going to be affecting us here
Yes.
in the States as far as supply chains. So,
Absolutely.
shoot.
Dr. Bair, I'd like to go into a kind of basic analysis here. What exactly is the nature of the economic reality in our current COVID economy, Biden presidency, that sparked the inflation problem from the beginning?
Like, you really going right to the core of the issue, right? Like my take on what caused the inflation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think that, so let me go back, okay? 300 years of economic theory, right? One of the oldest economic theories that there is, even before economics was a separate field, um, was a theory of inflation, and this theory today is called the quantity theory of money. It basically takes four economic variables, which are the money supply, the velocity of money, and then the price level and the nominal GDP. And it says this is the equation of exchange, right? So, given that so what are these variables, right? The money supply is how much money there is, right? The velocity of money is how quickly does it change hands? How many transactions are there, per day or week or year, right? Per whatever cycle we're talking about, right? So how often do people interact with markets is basically what the velocity of money is, right? And then we have the price level and nominal GDP. And what makes this a theory of inflation is to say, well, GDP changes only relatively slowly, even in a rapidly growing economy, right? And the velocity of money also is pretty stable. It depends on, basically the level of economic development of the society, right? So what do we get from this? Well, we get that if there's an increase in the money supply, there's going to be an increase in the price level, and that is inflation, right? Like I said, this is the oldest theory of inflation that there is. We've had a lot of time to think about this theory. I think it is the most logical explanation for what causes inflation. People talk about, inflation is caused by corporate greed and, corporations taking advantage of the situation, whatever. My question with regard to that is, could you please tell me when corporations are not greedy, right? They are greedy all of the time, right? I mean, they always want to increase profit. So what makes it possible for them to increase prices now and not last year, let's say, right? And I think the thing that makes it possible is, well, we created $10 trillion of new money, at least, right? I mean, because of the nature of money and banking, because of our fiat monetary system, it's actually very difficult to measure how much money is being created at any given time, right? We know it's on the order of about $10 trillion, right? And that's a significant amount for the economy to absorb, right? Now, people say, okay, well, why is money creation not instantly result in inflation? Well, because money creation mostly goes into financial markets, right? It goes into bonds, it goes into boosting stocks, right? And this is not the real economy. This is the financial economy, but they're connected, right? Because the purpose of making money in finance or whatever, Marxian Gandalf. Okay, that's great. Thank you. The purpose of making money anywhere is to spend it, right? And what happens when you spend it? What happens when the Fed or all these institutions, right, bail out and boost financial markets or real estate markets, or prevent banks from collapsing? All this happens is they're creating money out of thin air. That money is ultimately going to enter consumer markets. Is it going to enter right away? No, there's a complex transmission mechanism, right? So we're not necessarily going to see, okay, a 5% increase in the money supply is instantly going to result in 5% inflation. Not necessarily, right? It's a complicated transmission mechanism, but the point is it will eventually enter, right? And it will eventually boost prices. I think that is indisputable. So that is my perspective, right? Whenever we rapidly increase the money supply, we're going to see an increase in the price level. Is it going to be exact? Is it going to be immediate? Maybe not, right? Because there's a whole transmission mechanism.
That's a very interesting point, inflection point for me, right? Because you're touching on something that I really pay attention to, which is Federal Reserve policy.
Right.
we are in the particular post 2008 crash. From what I have read and what I've been told from people who work in the financial services sector, all of the traditional norms of American capitalism have been completely broken, pretty much, particularly on monetary policy. And what
We've
I
had
mean by
years of extremely low interest rates. I mean, it's very, very unusual, right? I mean, like since the Great Recession, interest rates have been super, super low. And but the question is like, how does that matter, right? Because the other big thing that's been happening that the Fed can't really seem to do much about is that banks have this enormous amount of excess reserves, right? Which they began to accumulate right during the Great Recession. And excess reserves is like, this is money that banks could theoretically loan, right? But they're choosing not to loan. And this is contrary to the profit motive, actually, right? Because banks always want to, I shouldn't say always, but they want to loan as much as they possibly can, right? This is the key to their profits. The one exception to that is if they feel that they're over leveraged, right? They're horribly over leveraged, and then they start to pull back. Then that's when you see excess reserves. There were no excess reserves before the financial panic hit in 2008, the end of 2008, early 2009. Banks all of a sudden realized they're horribly over leveraged, and they stopped lending, right? And that halting of lending, I think, is the prime cause of the Great Recession, because businesses can't finance investment, right? 80% or so of business investment is financed. Then they're not going to be able to do that investment. If they're not going to be able to do that investment, this is a big negative for job growth, for just for existing production, right? So this excess reserve overhang, right? The way that the Fed dealt with that is by having very low interest rates, but it actually never really touched the issue. Like the excess reserves only moderately dwindled over time. They're still sitting on big excess reserves. So it's a kind of question, right? Like this is historically very different, right, from the entire history, 100-year or so history of the Fed.
Yeah, well, the problem I particularly have is that after the 2008 crash, where we have, I mean, billions, if not trillions of American dollars evaporate, the political establishment in this country, particularly under the Bush and Obama administration, decide to bail out the banks and basically bankroll their egregious fraud that caused the subprime crash with the TARP money,
Right.
And what I found interesting is that the way in which the Federal Reserve, starting with Geithner and going onward, orchestrated monetary policy between maintaining low interest rates and quantitative easing, it literally created a paradigm where they did a double subsidizing of the banks and financial institutions, because what you did when you kept interest rates low, you set up a parity trade situation that pretty much only the banks can benefit from, meaning that interest rates in America are at a 0.0%, but interest rates in Australia are at 0.5. So I'm going to borrow money because I'm a bank and I can do that from America at 0.0, and I'm going to lend money in Australia at 1.2, and I'm going to make tons of money doing that. And it
Right.
literally created a situation where banks are circulating money into each other. And then you combine that with the quantitative easing, which is basically the Federal Reserve is buying mortgage-backed securities and basically facilitate, those are, quasi-government bonds, as if you will, and printing money, increasing liquidity.
Can I interject this monkey wrench into the conversation? Speaking of mortgage-backed securities, and since I recently had to do this, my history of my life in that industry, there was an article in Business Insider that said something along the lines of, "We're not going to see another housing crisis like 2008." Mainly because the people buying the houses aren't people taking out mortgages. We're looking at
people.
There's it's a mix, right? There is a lot of capital buying out single family residences. There's also people that have fully vested in their IPOs and all that other shit from tech companies that are literally putting in cash offers. There's a lot more of that than there is corporations buying up single families, but corporations are buying single families. It is a horrible combination. Do you think that will prevent the same thing that we saw in 2008?
No, not at all. But first of all, let me just say that's a good point. Hedge funds and other big investors, real estate investment trusts and so on, are major players in the real estate market, right? And including residential real estate, right? Including homes meant to be rental properties and so on, right? Now, the problem with all of this, I think, mathematically or economically, is that there's always the issue of like, what is the return on investment, right? So when real estate prices become high, they tend to real estate bubbles, you see this, right? Because the home price to rent ratio gets way out of whack, right? Because rental prices cannot grow as fast as home prices, because rental prices are always tied to like the median income, right? I mean, like, people can only afford so much rent, period, right? I mean, like, if they're not getting big raises, the rent prices cannot grow, right? I mean, that's just a fact, right? But home prices can, right? Because if new money goes into the home market, then those prices are going to go up. But that creates a problem, right? Because if you're buying properties like these hedge funds are as investments, which is then to earn an income, right? Well, the question is, how large is the income relative to the expenditure on the asset, right? And that is the return on investment, right? As the home price increases faster than the rental price, the return on investment gets lower and lower, right? And so what happens, like, when that return on investment, let's say it becomes negative in real terms, right? I mean, and that's particularly acute when the rate of inflation is like 8.5%, right? That means anytime you're getting less than 8.5% return on something, you're losing money effectively, right? So, like, is the income that you're going to get on your rental property equivalent, like net of maintenance and all of the costs, right? Is that going to equal an 8.5% return? I mean, because when home prices get too high, the answer is absolutely no, it will not, right? And that creates a problem because, well, then the money that entered the housing market is going to flee the housing market seeking higher returns somewhere else, right? I mean, that's just the math, right? I mean, and this is how all these guys think, because you have to, right? You're in the search for returns. If you're a speculative investor, you are in a competitive struggle with every other speculative investor for above market returns, right? And so, real estate looked good when you were getting good returns from it, but then the minute it stops looking good, then the money leaves real estate, and then what happens, right? Prices are going to fall, and that ratio starts to get back to its historical average. I don't know. I hope this is making sense to everybody. I don't know.
I want to ask you another question. What do you make of the explanation that people were saying for a few months that the inflation was caused by a COVID supply chain problem, in that because of the inability to transport goods and services through international thoroughfares because of labor shortages or a variety of other things, it was causing a lack of ability to transport materials that were needed on a retail level, and as a result, prices started to go up?
Yeah, probably some of that is true, but I don't think that that's a coherent explanation for the whole thing, because if that's true, then we should see the prices go down once things have passed, let's say, right? I haven't seen that so far. There's certainly, if there's a choke point in something, then we're going to see rising prices in the short term, right? But, this, all right, I got to respond to this comment. Somebody said rising housing prices is not inflation. That's an asset price bubble. It's true that rising home prices is not well reflected in the CPI. But this is part of the issue, right? The part of the issue is that we only measure prices. We only measure consumer prices, right? We don't measure asset prices. And so when new money, which overwhelmingly goes into asset markets, right, boosts those markets, boosts the prices in those markets, we don't consider that inflation, right? Like, the Dow goes from 10,000 to 33,000. We don't say, oh wow, that's inflation, right? We say, fantastic news, stock market's going great, the economy's doing well, right? but this is a very narrow-minded view, right? I mean, like, inflation has to be considered I mean, if we are considering it in the old-fashioned way, right, which is what is the average price level of everything, right? Now we don't do that because, basically, like tradition, right? We have this, the CPI is a market basket of certain consumer goods, right? It doesn't include financial assets. So by definition, that's true, right? We don't consider rising prices of asset prices to be inflation, but that's not good, right? I mean, that's that's a kind of problem in our perception, we should, right? We should look at everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, what about the situation with labor? People are saying now, allegedly, unemployment numbers are pretty good. Some people are saying that I've heard economists say, "Oh, we're coming on full employment in America right now," and I'm like, how are we going to say we're coming on full employment when we're in a COVID economy where there are people who have been dropping out of the economy who aren't re-entering looking for work? And we all know that most of the labor numbers, unless you're talking about full labor participation rate, are not measuring people who have stopped looking for work.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So that's quite true. If you drop out of the labor market, you're not going to be counted as unemployed, right? You'll just count as, no longer participating in the labor market. You're not part of the civilian labor force anymore. So, that's an issue, right? And unemployment always has this issue because with unemployment, you're trying to measure something that is unobservable, right? Which is, okay, you have to not have a job, but you have to want a job, right? And you have to be, actively seeking employment in the last 4 weeks, right? This is the criteria. How do you measure when somebody wants a job, right? How do you measure what somebody wants? So they do this through surveys and whatever. They try to get a fix on this, but it's always an issue, right? Like, has somebody dropped out of the labor force because they have tried and failed to find work because their perception is, forget whether it's accurate or not, right? Their perception is there's not a job there for me, right? So, well, I'm going to do something else then, right? And then how do we count that, right? Do we count that as unemployment, or do we count that as, oh, that's just somebody's voluntary choice or whatever, right? So, this is a long established issue with unemployment numbers. For years, economists talk about, mostly from the left, right? Mostly commies like myself, right, said this, and the BLS sort of ignored it. And then in the 90s, they said, all right, we're going to introduce some new measures. We'll introduce a very broad measure of unemployment called the U6, which includes those who, dropped out of the labor market for economic reasons. It includes those who are working part-time, but full-time. These are all issues, right? Like, if all you can find is a part-time job, but you really need a full-time job, you're underemployed, right? I mean, and that becomes, but because the way the numbers are measured is if you have a job, you're not unemployed. So, these are definitional issues. I personally think that the U6 is just a better measure, and we should probably use that. But the U6 is always like about twice as high or so as the U3, which is the typical measure.
So, do you think that we're experiencing full employment, according to some who say, because unemployment is so low? Or what exactly? How do you gauge what's happening there?
No, I wouldn't say we're experiencing full employment. I mean, so the concept of full employment, this is one of these old debates between, the classical school, right, the neoliberal or neoclassical school of economics, and then the Keynesians, right? And, Keynes basically argues, look, economies are very rarely at full employment, right? Capitalism does not tend to produce full employment except sort of by accident, like maybe sometimes that happens. If it does, that's great. But a lot of times it doesn't, right? And that's the whole problem of a recession, right? Aggregate demand falls, and then we're no longer at full employment. When we're no longer at full employment, then we have scope to increase spending, right? Increase aggregate demand, and we will get economic growth as a result. So we should do that by any means necessary, right? Like, have the government spend more money, right? Finance it through debt. Use monetary policy, try to get businesses to invest, and so on, right? But then we come back to a debate like, are we at full employment, right? I think it's pretty hard to make that argument given that we're coming out of this unprecedented unemployment crisis, right, due to COVID, and we're just sort of barely emerging from that. And it typically, like, what is supposed to happen, right? Like, this is the classical argument is, if aggregate demand falls, the price level falls, and that brings everything back into balance, right? That restores aggregate demand because people spend more when prices are lower. But of course, what we see in recessions, we don't really see much in the way of falling prices, right? I mean, like, think of, like, Pascal, you've been around a long time, right? Think of the last time you saw significant deflation of any sort, right, in the U.S. economy. I mean, never, right?
No, not definitely, because I'm basically growing up in the 50-year period of the neoliberal transition, so that's not happening at all.
Yeah. So we never really see falling prices, and then we what we see is like varying shades of inflation, and we have this issue right now. I mean, the headline inflation number, right, 8.5%. If you didn't get an 8.5% raise last year, then you got a cut. I mean, that's the reality, right? Like, it's that unforgiving. And how many of us got an 8.5% raise last year, right? So we are looking at falling living standards for almost everybody. Like, I'm going to just say, back of the envelope calculation, if you're not in the top 10% of income earners, then there's no way that your income is keeping pace with inflation, unless you're working significantly more or something, right? Like, there's no way that if you're working the same number of hours, you're living as well as you did a year ago, period, right?
No, absolutely. What's happening is that basically your day-to-day expenses, your month-to-month expenses, are causing you to live in a deficit because everything is so much higher in price. And what do you make of some conservatives saying that it was Biden's COVID largesse that caused the inflation, i.e., the monies that were sent out, the child tax credit, the $600 that Biden sent out.
Wasn't most of that started during Trump, though?
I'm not saying I agree with the argument, but I've been seeing this argument that a lot of people on the right are saying that the inflation is a result of Biden's policies basically being too progressive in terms of trying to ameliorate the damage from COVID and basically putting so much money in people's hands that it caused inflation. I'm not saying I believe in that argument. What is your response to those who have been making it?
The amount of money that's gone to the average person is just very slight in terms of the total, so I wouldn't single that out, right? I mean, like, I'm with the conservatives to a point, right? I mean, because these are people who tend to stress money creation as a primary mechanism of inflation, as I have, right? So hey, I'm with you guys to a point, but let's not go crazy, right? Like, let's not act like the average person is made out like a bandit here. Are you kidding me? Like, where's most of the money gone? Like, most of the money has gone to where most of the money typically goes, which is to the top, right? So the average person is not what's driving inflation. That's just a tiny slice of the amount of money that's created. Now, it's great. The average person did get something, right? That's good. But things like that are not driven by a minority like that, right? The money has gone into pumping up financial markets. And so we see it filtering down from the top. Like, I don't see prices being driven by spending at the bottom, right? Let me give you an example, okay? I'm in Southern California, right? And Southern California has a housing market that's going kind of crazy, and that also includes the building side of the housing market, right? So unimproved land and then building, all this stuff is like massively backed up, right? Some of this is related to people all of a sudden being like, oh, well, maybe I could live much further from work because I'm telecommuting or whatever, right? But like, how is it? So like, one of the things that people notice in terms of inflation, like if you're in the building trades or whatever, you might notice that like lumber prices are like through the roof, right? Like, like a piece of lumber, like a 2x10 or whatever, that used to cost, let's say, $8, now costs like $60, right? I mean, like, that's a pretty big increase, right? I mean, like, you notice a price change like that, right? I mean, like, that's a multiple of what it used to be, right? And so the question would be like, why, right? What's driving that, right? Who is driving a building boom in Southern California? And I will just say to you, it is not the average wage earner, right? This is not driven by those who are right at the median, right? This is driven by like who's doing all the building, right? That is coming from the top, you know? So just a kind of, back of the envelope little example, right? Where I don't think it makes economic sense, and I don't see the evidence that price increases are being driven by the bottom of the income distribution, not at all.
Well, one of the things that some have argued is contributing to the inflation is that in the face of what was deemed to be the Great Resignation, because there was a temporary labor shortage, management or capital had to increase subsidies to labor in terms of concessions. In other words, they would give people salary increases. And the argument is being made is that the need to raise salaries and put more money in people's hands circulated more capital in the economy and helped fuel the inflation as well. Do you think there's any truth to that?
There's some truth to it, but again, we're talking about the top part of the income distribution, not the bottom. We're not talking about most people. And this is kind of like the impression that you get, like if you watch a lot of media, right? Like media does not focus on the average person, right? Media focuses on the top 20%, top 10%, right? That's who you see reflected on the media, and that's whose concerns you see reflected as well, right? So, is that cohort driving some of the price increases? Well, yeah, because that cohort includes the top 1%, whatever, right? And this is where, like I'm saying, it filters down. I mean, like who owns the vast majority of stocks, bonds, real estate, financial assets? It's the very rich, and so whenever those assets get boosted in price, it is the very rich that benefit disproportionately. But that there's always a certain buffer there, right? Like that the top 10% is going to benefit more than the bottom 10%, certainly, right? Or the 10% that's directly adjacent to them, et cetera.
Well, let's get. I mean, I'm fascinated by your responses because I'm basically giving you the explanations that people who are much more conservative in their politics than we are to try to rationalize this inflation. And your response is that basically that the people who are benefiting from capitalization in those categories, in other words, benefiting from having more money, are not large enough of a percentage of the economy to be causing the inflation because it's on the lower end of the overall wealth distribution. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, so in this sense, there's two things economists talk about, right? When you talk about payments to the average person, like especially during a recession, right? One of them is stimulus, and like everyone called the COVID checks stimulus checks, right? Stimmy checks. I would call them stabilization. That's the other term that economists use, right? Stabilization means, yeah, we're giving out payments. It's not to stimulate, it's to prevent spending from free falling, right? Because a lot of people lost their jobs. I mean, we had unemployment numbers that were just through the roof, right? I mean, like, and what's going to happen when, 20 million unemployment claims, going up from like 1, right, to 20 in a single week? Well, there's going to be less spending, right? So, okay, you rush checks to people just to stabilize their spending, right? Are you going to stimulate spending? Are you going to expect to like boost spending? No, that's crazy, right? You're just expecting to kind of keep it near the same level or something, or prevent it from falling too much, right? So we have to kind of keep that in mind, right? Like the stimulus checks, as we call them, are not really stimulus. They're more like to prevent a disaster or prevent a bigger disaster than what we saw, because COVID did represent a major hit to GDP and spending, right? However, we also saw that spending bounce back. So COVID is a very unusual phenomenon, right? But I don't think it makes, like when you look at the macro data, I just don't see the support for that to say like the average person receives so much, the government money that now that's boosting prices. No, they got barely enough to like, give to their landlords, right? I mean, And speaking of, right, this is where a lot of this money also went right directly into the pockets of landlords. Um, so I just don't see that as like, that doesn't make sense to me as what's driving price increases, right? That's
I
not.
agree with your position on that. And here's a question. I got a super chat here from Big Woes, Wos de Lambre. Okay, so inflation is being caused primarily by our overlords, just like every single other society malady. Awesome. I guess that's a statement more than a question.
Yeah, I mean, who is.
I was actually about to get to that, and let me frame it for you, Asatar, so maybe you can address it, right?
Okay.
So we realize that the average citizens who were beneficiaries of the stimulus packages, whether they be unemployment checks, stimmy checks, or whatever, are too low on the wealth distribution scale to have been causing the inflation, right? But we were still in a period of massive low interest rates and quantitative easing that really is nothing but a subsidy to finance capital. And as we saw, stock valuations of the market went through the roof during a time where you had massive unemployment, downward spiraling of GDP, overall health crisis, and the market is going crazy, and the literal asset augmentation of top Fortune 500 or 100 companies goes through the roof. So the question becomes, is the inflation caused by the fact that major corporations are doing large-scale stock buybacks, and because they're the only ones who are flush with liquid capital, they're basically hogging up securitized assets and real assets, housing, real estate, bonds and stocks, and are fueling prices going up, as well as maybe corporations price gouging for goods and services.
I don't like the term price gouging because that to me suggests a kind of like, that suggests that the greed is a primary thing, right? Again, I see like greed and the profit motive as being constants. This is just capitalism. So I think like, well, what gives them the ability to raise prices, right? Or what actually bids up prices, and it seems to be driven, right, by all indications it's driven by demand, but so then the question is, well, where does the demand come from? Does the demand come from the average person's buying power? And again, I see zero evidence of that, right? Like, the price increases, first of all, are much stronger than wage growth, right? So we're not, these price increases are not being driven by the average consumer. They're not being driven by wage growth. What then are they being driven by? Well, I think the difference is, well, there's that money creation, right? And where does the money creation come? Where does it go to, right? Well, the prime beneficiaries are those who are close to the monetary transmission mechanism, right? Which is, if you're close to the assets, right? Like, do you make your living from speculating in financial assets? Are you one of these big financial corporations? The Goldman Sachs of the world, right? The kings of Wall Street, or someone who is kind of adjacent to that field, right? And that comprises like a fair number of people, right? I think that's the group that I would say is the most directly responsible for price increases. But I'm not saying it's that group necessarily, right? It's driven by like, where do they get the money to actually have effective aggregate demand, right? Well, they get it from money creation. I mean, that's my short answer to this.
When you say money creation, how do you define that?
Well, it's the stuff we've been talking about, right? So part of it is the quantitative easing, right? Quantitative easing is money creation.
Monetary policy, Fed policy.
Yeah, but there's a bunch of ways that money creation happens, right? It happens through Fed policy, but the biggest way that money creation happens is just through the run-of-the-mill working of the banking industry. I mean, like, that is where, I mean, for those who are interested, by the way, I have a whole lecture on this on my YouTube channel that's just about, what is money creation, what is money destruction, how does this operate? We have our banking system is literally able to create money out of thin air, and it's very decentralized. We think of it as coming from the Fed, right? Like, oh, the Fed creates money. That's true. The Fed does create money, but the Fed is not the only institution that creates money, right? Anyone who creates debt creates money. That's the reality, right? So there's 1,000,001 sources of money creation in the economy. Banks, credit card issuers, what are called shadow banks, right? These are financial institutions, like E-Trade or Ameritrade or Goldman Sachs or whatever, right? These are brokerage accounts that also offer checking, right? These are also money creators, right? They are creating money out of thin air that is completely unbacked by anything. Now, the risk that this entails for the economy is that it can easily reverse itself, right? Like I talked about how banks piled up excess reserves, and they piled up $2.5 trillion of excess reserves. So it's a significant amount of money, right? What that means is that money was not being lent, right? That is money destruction. That is the process working in reverse, right? So money destruction reduces aggregate demand just as money creation increases it, right? So if you ask the question, why do we get volatility? Why are there recessions? Like why should there be volatility in spending? Why should there be economic growth and contraction anyway, right? Like why should that happen? Well, we'll look at the thing that it's correlated with. It's correlated with when does the money supply grow and when does it contract, right? And why does it grow and contract? Well, because we have this fractional reserve banking system, right? That's what it does. I mean, like if you guys read a textbook, you will literally see the phrase money is created out of thin air. That is, I'm not making that up, right? That's in every monetary economics textbook. And it's crazy when you think about it. You're like, is this economics or is this magic? Like, I mean, created out of thin air. How the hell does this work, right? And if it can be created out of thin air, it can also be destroyed, right? So, and this has real economic effects, right?
Well, I'd like to pivot a bit to crises that that are clearly fueling increased inflation, but are not really related to COVID, but are tied to this Ukraine crisis. Number one, and we know this is a constant and it almost always correlates to inflation, increase in fuel costs and food production shortages due to low wheat or corn or other stocks, food stocks being in the market. Now, these things definitely, would you agree, these are things that can have a major effect on inflationary pricing?
Yeah, absolutely. And these are things which we're seeing. I mean, we're seeing these in our everyday lives, right? I mean, anybody who's buying gas is like, what the hell's going on, right? Like anybody who's buying food is like, wow, right? Food's a lot more expensive. So is that being driven to some extent by the conflict, by how global markets are reacting in terms of commodity prices, right? Absolutely, right. There's certainly a role that's being played there. Sometimes people look at this and say, well, okay, global oil prices are still lower than they were a year ago, and we weren't seeing the same kind of effects on gas prices, right? Which is true, right? So, I'm not sure how to answer this exactly because I mean the answer to your question is basically yes, right? Like, but how does that then help us to understand, these larger forces, right?
Do you think also that the Federal Reserve's decision to increase interest rates is a labor disciplining move? I.e., like in the Volcker shock, there was a belief by Volcker and the Carter administration that they needed to break labor, basically, and that doing so through increasing interest rates would do that. And it literally worked. Do you think that because of the belief that labor is being too highly compensated because of the COVID, and that the Fed is going to use that as a pretext to say it's causing inflation, that one of the motivations behind their arguments that they're going to be increasing rates regularly is to be a labor disciplining in terms of either cut down pricing for labor, or in other words, people are going to have their salaries go down, or literally people are going to get fired? Because what's going to happen is that if there's going to be no money circulating because interest rates are going up, that means no one's going to borrow money. No one's going to borrow money. No one's going to borrow. That means that investing in hiring, job expansion, construction, all of the things that increase labor participation dry up. So do you see that one of the motivations of the increase of interest rates is inflation as a pretext, but labor disciplining as an actual goal?
It's a little hard to say because I think the Fed is quite dishonest actually about what is the functioning of interest rates, and why do they lower them? Why do they raise them? How important is this as a mechanism? Banks. So here's the way it's supposed to work, right? This is like what everybody learns who takes like intro to macro or whatever, right? What you learn is the interest rate that the Fed controls. This is called the federal funds rate, okay? And this isn't an interest rate that's relevant to the average person, right? This is an interest rate that is only relevant to the banking system, okay? So it's kind of like the lowest interest rate that exists in the economy, which is the rate at which banks lend each other money for their reserves, right? And so you say, all right, they have reserves, right? They're supposed to nominally keep on hand 10% of the money that's deposited, right? So for every $100 that's deposited in banks, they can loan out $90 of it and keep on hand $10. Now, this is already insane, right? Because the question is, wait a minute, like you're lending out almost all the money that you take in. How the hell is this supposed to work, right? And this is in fact one of history's greatest cons, one of history's greatest shell games, right? Is we allow banks to essentially make use of something which does not belong to them, right? That's other people's money. And then we socialize the risk of that, right? So that if something happens, oh, we didn't get the money back from some of these loans, we made bad loans. Well, then the Fed is there to, say, all right, we'll give you the money, right? So, the question is like, does it really matter, right? Banks supposedly, right? They lend more when the federal funds rate is lower because they know that they can always, they can borrow more cheaply in order to maintain their reserves, right? But the thing is that banks have very well established loopholes to this, right? They can do what's called a repurchase agreement or a repo, right? Meaning they can move assets off their balance sheet so that they no longer count relative to their reserve ratio. Okay, it's a well-known loophole. So the question is, or they can, like, if they're a multinational bank, they can take advantage of something called euro dollars, which is basically like money that's held in a branch like Bank of America or Wells Fargo or whatever, right? These are big international banks. They have branches all over the world, right? So if they hold money notionally in some other country, well, that money no longer counts toward their reserve ratio, right? But what does it mean to hold money in another country? Money is basically an accounting entry, right? Almost all of it is an accounting entry. So how do you hold money in another country? Well, don't you just label it that's in another country, right? I mean, like, you see what I'm saying, right? If it's an accounting entry, then where does that exist? It exists nowhere, right? It exists everywhere. It's information. So banks understand this, right? They understand this very well. They can circumvent the Fed's reserve ratio anytime they want. And when you look at what they actually hold, when you look at their actual reserves relative to their actual deposits, 10% is a complete fiction, right? And during the boom, it's less than 1%, right? So when we go back to like 2007, right, when the economy was booming, before they started stacking up all these excess reserves, they were holding hardly anything, right? They were holding like 86 cents per $100, right? Not $10, 86 cents, right? And then they realized, oh my God, right? We're basically existing in a zero reserve system. The tiniest fluctuation, the tiniest downturn is going to kill us here. So I think, what the Fed says, oh, we monitor interest rates super carefully, and we do that to fight inflation. It's like, are you kidding me, right? The Fed props up an insolvent system for the benefit of those at the top of the system. And now you want to tell me that you care about inflation? I mean, that's a joke, right? I mean, like, you sit on top of and maintain the greatest inflationary system ever known to man, right? That's what you do. And then you have the audacity to tell us it's about inflation. It has nothing to do with inflation, right? It has to do with keeping the banking sector going, right? Preventing it from collapsing because it's permanently insolvent, right? I mean, that's the reality of the banking system.
Can you explain on how the threat of inflation adversely affects the banking system? in specific ways?
Well,
What is the Fed worried about in that context?
I don't think they are, right? They're worried about our banks going to collapse, right? If you look at the 350-year history of central banking, central banks were created to protect private banks. They were not initially part of the government, right? I mean, they were created in order to move liquidity around the system to prevent bank failure, right? But banks responded to that in the typical way that any profit maximizer is going to respond to somebody reducing your level of systemic risk, which is they're going to take on more risk, you know? It's like, oh, you're going to protect me from my consequences? Fantastic. I love it. I'm going to take much bigger risks then, right? Because that's where the profits are, right? So I don't think that, inflation is sort of the boogeyman that central banks always talk about. Oh, we do everything we can to defeat it. I think that's nonsense. I don't think they care that much about labor either, to be honest, right? I don't think that bankers they're not primarily involved with disciplining labor, right? They care about it, right? Because they invest in all kinds of productive industries, and they do care about profits in those industries. But they are not the primary ones who discipline corporations, right? Or discipline workers, let's say, right? Now, if a corporation is not doing well, okay, their stock price is going to not fare well, right? They might not be able to borrow as much. So banks do play a role disciplining corporations, but it's not. All I'm saying is, they're not direct. I don't think they're directly concerned with disciplining labor. I think that's more of the industrial capitalist realm.
Okay. So you say that you don't think that really the discipline of the labor is a consideration. So the question becomes then, what is the only way that anything can be done policy wise to cut down this inflation is Fed rate hikes? Are there any other options?
Well, we have a system that is inflationary by its nature, right? I mean, we could. I think, you want to ask me, like, what would be a non-inflationary system? Well, I mean, we're talking about some kind of commodity standard then, right? I mean, that's, as they call it, the gold standard. Now, gold standard does not by itself create price stability, right? Because if you have that along with a fractional reserve system, you still have the opportunity for crisis. You still have money creation, right? So, but if we want to talk about what would it take to end inflation, that's a kind of a different conversation, right? We would have to restructure the banking system. Given that we have the banking system that we have, the question is, how do we prevent it from just going belly up, right? Because, like I say, it's permanently insolvent. So how do we prevent markets from recognizing the insolvency and acting on that insolvency, right? That is primarily what the central bank does, in my view, right? I think the idea that they try to maintain full employment, this is a thing that they say, absolute nonsense. I don't believe that for 1 second. Or the idea that they try to prevent increases in the price level, I think that's also nonsense. They don't try to do that either.
We got a super chat here we want to take from Joey. Aren't we downplaying the impact of supply? At work, I see parts of that used to take 2 weeks now to 10 when supplies drop. Those will cost people. We talked about that. We talked about how the supply chain is considered to be a large part of the problem of what's causing the inflation due to the COVID. But you're saying that can only last so long, Dr. Bair?
I think it can only last so long, right? I mean, because just conceptually, you're right. It should bid up prices, but in the short term, right? So then the question is, when that passes, do we see prices return to normal, right? I don't think I mean, that's an open question. Let's see what happens, right? I could be wrong, but I doubt it. That's my, I'll just go out there on This Is Revolution. I doubt that we're going to see prices return to normal. I mean, we might see some decreases, but I don't think we're gonna go back to the same price level that we saw before. So
someone has a question for you, Dr. Bair. This is a Dr. Bair question. Let me find it. Oh God, the chat is moving very fast.
The chat is on fire. Yeah, I can't follow it.
Okay, here it goes. It's on the screen now. Can you ask about the bankers on Mao's Long March and how the parallel currencies affected the revolution?
Whoa, you blew me away with that question. Didn't you?
That's a good question.
Are you trying to find a parallel to here with Mao's China and the current situation, Cherries? Because they're not the same.
Well, what we see, I guess I'll try to answer this broadly in terms of socialism. What we see in the Soviet Union, what we see in China is, we have these successful socialist revolutions, and then there is, a takeover of the banking sector by the state, right? And then banking is run in a kind of a different fashion, right? Now it's similar, right? Because these are countries which continue to have fractional reserve system. They do a number of different things with their currencies, right? So at times, right, the Soviets do have a gold-backed currency at one point, right? They also have like a fiat version, right? And the same thing with China. But China is that they have a fractional reserve banking system. They have a fiat monetary system. The thing that's a little that they do that's different is the state takes a very active role in terms of planning and investment, right? So and they use their control over the banking sector to serve those goals, right? And I think what you see motivating that, right? You see a couple of things, right? One is economic development, right? So they want to fund, the projects which they see as critical, right, in the planning process, right? And China has done this incredibly successfully, right? That is, start with the basic industrialization and then move up the value ladder to produce higher and higher value added manufacturing goods, right? So, under Mao, we're talking about the pig iron, and these are like basic industrial commodities, right? You need iron, you need steel to make almost everything else, right? So you develop that first, right? You develop textiles, you develop the lumber industry, you develop concrete, right? These are all just primary industrial products. But this is not how you really develop the forces of production. It's only step one, right? So to do that, you got to start producing things like tools and cars, and right. So the CPC was always on top of this, right? Was always like, okay, how can we use the banking sector to meet our goals in terms of our plans, right? And that is different, right? That's not the common pattern of industrial development under capitalism, because capitalism is typically the anarchy of production, right? So no one is really in charge of it. Banks invest in whatever they think is most profitable, right? There's no overarching plan. So that part of it is very different. I'm not sure if I'm speaking to the question. I don't think I fully understand the question, but I'm open to a follow up if you want.
Someone asked, what is the full impending ramifications of this quantitative easing?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I don't think anybody knows that.
Yanis Varoufakis believes that it's causing us to transition into what he calls techno-feudalism.
Or just good old-fashioned capitalism?
Techno-feudalism, that's a great phrase, which nobody really knows what that means, or at least I don't.
I think it's, look, man, I think it's a way to wake, this is just my opinion, Giannis isn't here to tell me to F off, but it feels like a way to start a conversation where people can start talking about capitalism in a negative light that gets into more mainstream conversations. And I don't like I understand people like, oh, I don't get it. It's stupid. Like, I get why people say stuff and they laugh and say, you don't know what you're talking about. But I think it's just a slick way to be like, look, no one's going to listen to you, but we're going to market anti-capitalism in a way that gets a conversation going that's beyond there is no other alternative. Because I think right now, a lot of the propaganda, even the anti-capitalist movies and stuff like that you see, it always ends with there is no other alternative.
Right. Yeah. Well, are we still on the topic of like what's going to happen with all this?
Yeah, well, someone's asking for the ramifications of the impending ramifications of quantitative easing?
One of the things we're seeing now, right, is okay. So once if we have a bunch of quantitative easing, which then starts to filter down into consumer prices, which is what we're seeing. Well, the question is like, where do you go from there, right? Because if you do more quantitative easing, well, you're going to see more inflation, right? And the central bankers of the world are aware of this, right? They're like, we need to kind of pull this back, given that we're no longer in a kind of crisis to capitalism moment, right? We are moving back into a kind of normal moment for where profits do not need to be propped up, or banks are not at risk of like wholesale bank failure, let's say, right? So what do we do? And the term that central bankers use is we're going to soak up liquidity, which I think is hilarious, because I think liquidity is one of these bullshit terms in economics that when somebody uses it, it's like almost certainly they're lying, like, because liquidity has so many meanings, right? Like banks say, well, dealing with a liquidity crisis, and it's like, you're not actually, right? You're dealing with an insolvency crisis, like your problem is that you lent out all of the money which you took in, right, which didn't belong to you. That is called insolvency. That's not called liquidity, right? I mean, liquidity is, oh, I have assets, but those are, not in liquid form, right? They're in real estate or something like this. I would need to liquidate them, sell them in order to have the money. That's liquidity, right? That's the traditional meaning of liquidity. Liquidity doesn't mean I have no assets whatsoever, right? Which is the situation that banks are in, right? So, okay, so what is the likely effect of this? Well, as the Fed moves to contraction, and particularly when almost everybody, like let's say the bottom 90%, right, is basically seeing a cut in their living standards due to inflation, this is a very bad situation, right? I mean, like, we all know this, it's bad for us. We're all feeling the decrease. I mean, every time you fill up your tank, right, you're feeling, I have less money for everything else, right? And that's a real thing,
Speak for yourself, American. It's $4 here.
Those in Mexico is the price of gasoline much lower in Mexico? Is that what you're telling me?
They were average. I think I might have said this on the show already. LA Times had an article saying that Californians were driving to Tijuana to get gas because it was so much cheaper. And the day after I read that, the gas station that leads to the highway had the gas in American prices, because everything here is in pesos and it's in liters. So there's a big sign that says $3.95 a gallon.
Oh, nice. Okay, well, I'm definitely visiting then.
I'm terrified to drive up. I have to drive up when the show is over. I'm going to leave like around midnight, and I am literally terrified because I haven't seen, like, the gas prices went up here like a couple pesos a liter, and 800 pesos didn't fill my tank, which is like $39 or so, $40. Ooh. And I was like, oh, dude, I'm so scared to go across.
Yeah, $40 just makes a kind of dent in your thing.
Oh, I'm so scared to go across the imaginary line.
So, I mean, I'm still trying to answer this question of like, what are the ramifications, right? We don't know, but like, we don't think it's probably not going to be good, right? Because like, okay, so the average working person is already suffering from price increases. Well, then what's going to happen when we see, rising interest rates, right? Which the Fed says we're in the business of taking away the punch bowl just as the party is getting going, right? So like, they take away the punch bowl, they take away the booze. Well, what's going to happen? There's going to be a slowdown. Typically that hurts investment, right? So that is a kind of double whammy for the average working person. And then how does it affect things like home buying or whatever else, right? Well, it affects it negatively, So we are basically just emerging from COVID, and then we have this, series of shocks, which is likely to hit, I think, in this year, certainly.
Oh, there we go. Well, Dr. Bair, excuse me as I come on. Thank you for joining us this evening and engaging in this very
What a
fruitful.
spirited group you have here. I feel like I'm
That's
only
live
just
tonight,
scratching the
boy.
surface.
Oh, also, if you guys want to follow Dr. Bair, hold on one moment, because we have the link. Unless I took it down. Nope. Here it is. If you want to follow Dr. Bair on Patreon, there you go. Patreon.com/Asatar Bair.
I've also mentioned a couple of my lectures on my YouTube channel. If you put in my name into YouTube, you'll see me come up there. And I have lectures on inflation. I have lectures on the banking system, on monetary policy and stuff. If you don't know that stuff, you can learn it there. Or if you know it already and you want to see like a little different angle on it, then check it out.
And for those that don't know, Dr. Bair wrote a book on prison labor.
Yeah, that was the topic
first
of my
interview
discussion.
we did. First interview we did was your book on prison.
Jason, you mind if I shout out a book that I just got today and I'm just skimming and it looks kind of fire, kind of hot?
Sure,
You want?
sure. Go for it.
I was introduced to, and I'm not ashamed I didn't know about this gentleman because I'm not an academic.
Mhm.
I started looking at this man's work so much, I bought a large value of his work. Dr. Bair, have you heard of Philip S. Foner?
Is that Eric Foner's brother?
I don't know, but he's a labor historian.
Aren't
This
they
guy
kin?
has some fire labor scholarship. I just bought Organized Labor in the Black Worker, 1619 to 1981 by Philip Foner.
I've heard of that, but I haven't read it. That looks good.
This book is off the meat racks with facts, data, and analysis. And labor union, labor history. I mean, there's a whole labor history here of Black workers that no one talks about. People think that labor unions and African Americans is a post-civil rights thing. That is a major fallacy.
Right. A lot of that labor history is fascinating and is very slept on. So it's good that you're doing your homework there. I need to do that too. I mean, there's so much to learn out there,
No, they're not related, but he does have a brother named Mo.
I put out a bit of a grip on some Philip Foner labor history books. Maybe, I don't know if it made me more than I should have, but I mean a grip.
Yeah.
I believe is Paul Prescott in the chat as well?
Paul Prescott is in the chat. Just saw him.
Because someone said Pyru Paul. If you remember Pyru Paul, then you have been watching this show for a long time. If you remember Pyru Paul. Because that is pretty funny. So Pascal, another thing that's been going on in the chat is people have been trying to decide who is going to play you in the movie about This Is Revolution.
It's going to be a movie about the show?
I don't know. I mean, one of us is probably going to have to die a horrible death for anyone.
We don't want that. Don't put that energy out in the world, man. The words have energy. We rebuke that in the name of the almighty power.
And I have a long drive, 500 plus miles I have to drive at midnight. But I am.
Are you going up to Oakland, man?
Hell yeah. I'm driving up to see the little ones who are not so little anymore. And hopefully a friend just hit me up. Hopefully I can see some friends. It does hurt my soul, and I'm going to say this on air so people that know me personally can hopefully feel a little bit bad that I have this beautiful home where I have something that I've never had before in my neighborhood, which is stray horses.
Wow.
There was like horses all over the place the other day, just chilling. Horses. That's some weird shit to me.
You gotta just jump on a stray horse and fucking ride off into the sunset, man. You know?
If I wasn't so, I was being a Karen. I was being a Karen about the horses. I'm not gonna lie, because the park. So the horse. I'm not even trying to be funny. I took a picture of it because I didn't think anyone would believe me. The horses were just roaming around the entire neighborhood. Keep in mind, I do live on top of a mountain off a dirt road. And I'll tell Joey, I'll tell you a funny story about Keegan Michael Key after I'm done with this and why he should play me if no this fake movie. The horses are running around. So the horses go into the park where I run. And sometimes the horses, they just shit. And they shit where I run. So it's like, now it's an obstacle course. And I'm not ready to do that type of cardio. I'm just trying to get my straight run on. I'm not trying to jump over shit. That's what literally. as well. And I don't know. I've never ran. I'm from a city.
Yeah.
Can I run with horses? Can I run around horses? I don't know. So another added adventure to my just daily run. And then I want to get mad. I want to find out who owns the horses so I can yell at them about the horse shit. But is that something you really yell about in Mexico?
I don't
when
think
you know
so.
where you live?
I think you get into a pack of horses and just start sprinting, you know, and just let the fucking feeling take you and just run off into the sunset. You know, that's what I'm visualizing.
What do you call a baby horse? Is there a name for a baby horse?
It's called a foal.
There was 2 of them. So again, I don't know. Maybe someone has horses and they knew that one was going to have a baby and they just let them. I'd never seen anything like that. I live by the ocean. It's gorgeous where I live. My friends don't come visit me. So that hurts my soul. My neighbors, they have friends come visit them because they know how dope it is to live over here.
Well, now I'm definitely going to come down and visit you. We're going to jump on some wild horses and just ride them bareback, man.
Right? You can do dope. There you can ride a camel down the street. There was a camel ride down the street in downtown. I was like, why the hell is there a camel downtown?
Yep.
Insane.
Sounds like Mexico, definitely.
No one comes to visit me. So before I go, someone said Keegan Michael Key should play Jason. So years ago, I was doing some work in a music festival that used to be in LA called FYF. It was where the LA Coliseum is. And this was 2017. And the company I was with, one of the clients was a comedian named Chris D'Elia. And
I've seen that guy. I've seen that guy do stand up. He's funny.
So we had to, the guy I was working with goes, come on, we got to go to the Comedy Store. We have to drop off some equipment to Chris D'Elia. He's going to get us in. And we get in and he tells us, if you want, you can go to this room and you can watch a battle that only comedians can be in with Jeffrey Ross. So it was a bunch of names in comedy and just LA in general, and a bunch of writers, comedy writers. And it was people literally working out their shit. Not so much stand-up, but they were like, they called it a roast battle, but it was literally just like, you know how when you talk shit with your friends, Pascal, when you were a kid, like your mom, like, and then it stops being about your mom and it's about you. Like, right. That's why you got this, you greasy motherfucker, and you ain't gonna be shit. Like there was like no cameras, no holds barred. So it was fun to watch, right? So it's after it's over, we all leave and we're all kind of hanging out, and no one knows who I am. So it's LA, so sometimes people just assume you're famous. So Jeffrey Ross was just being nice to me because he just, I don't know who this guy is. I'm probably a little fucked up, so let me just be nice to him. It could be Jamie Foxx. I don't know. So I'm talking to Jeffrey Ross, right? And so as I walk away, this guy grabs me. He's like, "Hey, man, can I get a picture with you?" I'm like, "I'm nobody." He goes, "I know who you are." I was like, "I'm nobody." He goes, "You're that guy from Key and Peele." I was like, "No, I'm not. My name is Jason Miles. I'm nobody." He's like, No. You're the guy." I was like, "Nah, man, I'm not the guy." He's like, "Why are you being a dick about this, man?" I was like, I'm not him. Like, I'm really not him. I'm not trying to be a dick to you, dude. I'm not him. You don't want a picture with me because I'm not the dude. And he was like, "Come on, man. Just come on. I love your stuff." And I was like, "Dude, I'm not." He wouldn't take no for an answer. Finally, he sneaks a selfie with me. What a fucking idiot.
Crazy.
True story.
Good
so
stuff.
On that note, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. Dr. Bair, again, thank you. You are welcome to come down here, especially when I come back. We got to go to the Lobster Town.
Yeah, that sounds like fun, man.
We can get cheap lobster up the road, eat it by the ocean and shit.
We're going to light it up.
Ride a camel. All right, guys. On that note, we're going out old school. Peace. Eventually.